Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Good to see you. Sorry, I was on the wrong Zoom link.
Yeah, no worries. We're all set now, so that's grand. Participants are just we've just started the webinar, so participants are joining. Just give it a couple of minutes. But with that, I wanted to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our attendees today. Welcome to our 60-minute webinar on embedding human rights into private equity, challenges and possibilities. My name is Anita Dorrit, and I am the director with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. I'm just giving it a couple more minutes or a couple more seconds, and then I would like to sort of kick off. But with that, maybe let me just do a little bit of background about the Investor Alliance. The Investor Alliance is a coalition of global institutional investors. We have more than 200 members across 18 countries, representing over 6 trillion in assets under management. Our members include asset managers, asset owners, public and private pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, foundations, and family funds. For those less familiar with us, the Investor Alliance's goal is to provide a collective action platform for responsible investing that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. And we do this in 3 different ways. The first is to promote investor responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct for institutional investors. We do this through capacity building activities like this webinar, as well as through the development of practical tools and guidance. This is like the Investor Toolkit on Human Rights, which we launched last year, which Ben, one of our panelists, has said that investors should keep under their pillow. So please make sure you do that. Our Investor Toolkit speaks to investment level commitments on human rights, relevant and essential across asset classes, and as well how these commitments can be applied to private equity funds, which we're going to speak more about today. The second thing we do is through corporate engagement, where we activate a broad base of investors to a coordinated approach to engagement with companies on their responsibility to respect human rights. We do this in close coordination with civil society and experts in this area. And the third is on standard setting, where we engage with policymakers and standard setting bodies to advocate for the creation of enabling environments so that we have a level playing field for responsible business conduct. Just a few quick logistics before we get started. The first is that we're recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar together with the slides will be made available to registrants shortly hereafter. The second is that you're all muted at this time, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. You can do this by typing your question into the Q&A box, and we will read this out during the session, or you can virtually raise your hand by clicking the hand icon on the right side of the screen, and we will call on you once we open up our Q&A session, time permitting, of course, as we would always love to hear from investors directly. With the exponential growth in sustainable investment and ESG funds, we've all seen changes in the public equities market, where public traded companies are now having to assess and address their impacts on people and planet, with increasing requirements for transparency and accountability. We are seeing the transition from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy, where the voices of various stakeholders and rights holders are heard and integrated into business decision-making and operations. However, the same cannot be said for private capital markets. By its inherent nature of privacy, private equity does not support disclosure, transparency, and accountability upon which ESG assessments depend. Private equity concentrates shareholder power. The role of private equity, including VCs or venture capital investors in providing financing for development and growth of private companies, has been increasingly and more recently under scrutiny. For example, it's been reported that universities, private foundations, and US retirement funds have been used to fund private tech startups like SenseTime and McVie that have grown into billion-dollar industry leaders in surveillance technologies that have been deployed in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to illegally surveil, track, and extrajudicially detain millions of ethnic Turkic Muslim majority peoples. All business enterprises, including financial institutions, whether lending or investing in the private or public capital markets, under the UN guiding principles, must respect human rights throughout their business activities. Private equity investors, whether in their roles as limited partners, LPs, or general partners, GPs, must take the necessary steps through human rights due diligence processes to ensure that their business activities and value chains respect internationally recognized human rights. And to take us through this critical, important issue and the challenges and possibilities of embedding human rights into private equity, we are indeed fortunate to have our amazing panelists today. We have Benjamin Copeland, who is the founder and CEO President of Empower, Michael Kleinman, Director of Amnesty International's Silicon Valley Initiative, Shameen Contractor, Senior Advisor at Oxfam, and Hannah Leach, who's a partner at Houghton Street Ventures and co-founder of Ventures ESG. So with that, to kick us off, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Benjamin Copeland, who prior to founding Empower, a social enterprise that provides strategic research guidance and training on corporate accountability for human rights, was also the founding executive director of PODER, a Latin American NGO recognized worldwide as a pioneer in the fields of corporate accountability, business, and human rights. Empower published the book Runaway Train, the perilous and pernicious part of private capital worldwide. And with that, let me hand off to Ben to tell us more about the private capital universe and human rights. Ben.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon for those of you on the other side of the pond and other places around the world. If you wouldn't mind fast forwarding to the next slide, please. Maybe one more. Okay, just briefly, I'm Ben, as said. We recently published this book, and I'll try to synthesize it in 10 minutes and speak with you guys today about it. Essentially, it's a book that tried to do a deep dive into the universe of private capital worldwide. So private equity is the largest typology of private capital. It's about 40% of private capital globally, but there's another 60% of the private capital universe, ranging from hedge funds to other types of fintech and crypto and other types of private capital that consolidates a much larger universe, if you will. So the overall book was written to see what is the kind of trajectory, what are some of the impacts on human rights and the environment and the public good of private capital. And we really had an eye towards looking at specific sectors where we thought the presence and perniciousness of private capital was especially worth noting. So if anyone is interested later on in getting a copy of the book or downloading it, feel free to contact me later. Next slide, please. So you can see on the screen, but private capital is essentially everything that is considered a unlisted investment. So direct investments that only an accredited, sophisticated investor can make. This essentially limits the world of private capital to something much smaller, of course, than the overall world of publicly traded debt and equities. That said, it's still hyper important because it's worth a ton of money and also has a big impact specifically in market making activities around the world. So today, most of the webinar is dedicated to private equity, but it's just worth mentioning the other big typologies of private capital are hedge funds, unlisted real estate, infrastructure, and natural resources commodities. These five make up almost the entire amount of the 11 trillion US dollars worth of private capital worldwide. This is a universe that's grown exponentially over the last 21 years. I have a data there that says it's grown 8x from 2000 to 2018. Now it's gone about 10x actually as a result of 2020 and 2021, when private equity in particular has really been investing like never before. There's a reason for that, and we'll get to it later, but it has a lot to do with the dry powder, which is the unspent, already raised private equity money that was really just frothing to get into action as a result of the pandemic. Currently, as mentioned, almost 11 trillion US dollars worth worldwide is what the private capital markets are worth. Of that, private equity and somewhere between 4.5 and 5 trillion US dollars worldwide. Traditionally, the US and the UK have been the major growth driver countries of private capital worldwide, including private equity. But more and more Asia, actually, specifically East Asia, is overtaking the US and the UK as both a source of fundraising and a source of investment for private capital. Next slide, please. So these are the types of headlines we're probably used to, which the Financial Times and others trumpet pretty ceremoniously on a daily basis around the world, right? The growth of private markets, the exponential activity of private capital and private equity in East Asia and China, the big, record-breaking deals that happen on a daily basis, the participation of big asset managers like BlackRock, and of course, more recently, especially in the last year and a half, the participation, at least nominally, of private capital and private equity firms specifically in ESG activities. Next slide, please. So the universe itself is the larger blue circle, which essentially is the overall value of private capital worldwide. Today, we're talking about the center circle, which is just private equity. And then later on, some of the panelists will be talking about the world of venture capital, which is a smaller subset of the overall private equity universe. As we can see on the far right, most recent estimates of venture capital value just in the US alone are about 130 billion US dollars, which is humongous. However, it's a tiny sliver of the overall private capital universe, and obviously a relatively small sliver of the private equity universe as well. Nevertheless, it's very important for its market-making activities, which we'll discuss later. Next slide, please. So this is a larger table, which we won't have time to get into today. But in our research, where we looked at over 1,000 sources, interviewed 40 plus experts, and spent 4 of us about a year working on the research for the book, we essentially found out there was no one-stop shop for understanding private capital, definitionally or otherwise, especially in the legal realm. There's very little actual legal definitions out there, few legal definitions out there about what private capital means. So we propose essentially an investment analysis continuum on the left, where we look at initial sources of investment. Hint, hint, this is all of us. We all contribute to private capital, whether it's employees, pensioners, investors, consumers. We all have some sort of input activity into the world of private capital. Fast forward across those 5 pillars on the far right, this is the actual markets where liquidity or exits take place, where private capital is converted back into liquidity and then used for other investments. So along that path of investment, they pass through different investment vehicles and legal jurisdictions, most specifically in tax avoiding or tax evading jurisdictions. Then there's different assets classes and sub-asset classes of private capital. Today, we're talking about private equity, but there's many others, about 40 that we were able to count. And then the final exit activity on the far right. So when we're thinking about this, listeners think of private equity as just the investor or the investment activity or the portfolio company in which it's invested. It's part of a larger universe, which both takes inputs from banks and asset managers in the forms of capital and actually spits it out the other side in the form of impacts, right? Impacts both on the financial markets as well on human rights and the environment. Next slide, please. I'll just say this quickly. The 2 big actors in the private equity universe are general partners and limited partners. I won't talk too much about that specifically right now, other than to say the largest kind of activities you hear about when you think of private equity are largely human rights impacts that are caused by general partners of private equity firms like Blackstone, like KKR. And those are the types of kind of more nominally obvious impacts that we're able to see around the world. But that's just the headline version of what private equity firms do and who they are. And there's obviously thousands of others, much more kind of almost secretive names and categorizations of private equity firms, which we'll have a lot of time to get into today. But it's worth mentioning that one of the largest reasons why private equity has escaped scrutiny all of these years is because a lot of it is really not public activity. It's not household names that are doing these impacts. A lot of them are off-book activities. And so it's also very difficult to get our heads around what is the universe of private capital. Next slide, please. When we talk about limited partners, I'm kind of looking at those of you on the call who are hopefully joining us from the pension fund or asset management world. That's where most of the limited partner investment comes from for private equity activity. So pension funds are the largest typology of limited partners investing in the private equity sector. There are others, including endowments and foundations of different organizations. But the list before us also has a larger group of limited partners who actually invest in this world. So together, general partners plus limited partners form private equity funds, and together they acquire companies or invest, whether by spending equity or debt capital in other companies. And that's essentially the universe of private equity. Next slide, please. These are the headlines that caused us to write the book and what we're seeing more commonly across the globe. You can read these for yourself. But essentially, these are the types of labor rights, human rights, environmental impacts, and impacts on the public good, which worried a lot of us and actually was the motivation for having this webinar today. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, private equity lacks transparency, lacks accountability, and lacks public good for a significant amount of reasons. This disclosure reason is probably the most important, simply because it is not required to disclose at the same level of publicly traded equity or debt. Therefore, there's less information available to both regulators as well as investors. Hence the reason why the private capital universe is actually limited to accredited, sophisticated investors, because theoretically they have more information to be able to make quote unquote smarter investment decisions to know whether private capital deserves their capital in the first place. That said, private capital, as mentioned earlier, does actually get some of our dollars, those of us who are not sophisticated and accredited investors, in different ways. And it also has public inputs, public impacts. So though the SEC definition, let's say, is limited to sophisticated and accredited investors, nevertheless, since it has a larger amount of impact and a larger footprint, if you will, there's a large worry around private equity that it doesn't disclose at the correct level of transparency like other companies do. Also, it lacks regulation. Part of that is that a lot of the private capital is not based in heavily regulated jurisdictions. A lot of it is in fiscal paradises in other parts of the world. So that's also one limitation on the regulation issue. But the other is, of course, a lack of political will. So in the book, we talk a lot about the privatization, financialization, and state capture phenomena that contributed to the increase, the 8 to 10x increase of private capital over the last 20 years. That's a lot of the background, if you will, that contributed to this environment and the lack of accountability in the first place. And then the taxation issue. I think people on the call will probably be familiar with the issue of carried interest and other forms of tax avoidance or tax evasion by private capital firms, including private equity, but they're classically known for not paying their fair share of taxes. Going down the list quickly, another big threat, I think, from private capital and private equity specifically is the acceleration of capital from public markets into private hands. So as we might know, the overall amount of stock market activity over the last 20 to 30 years has declined significantly, almost by half. Those stock market capitalizations up, the amount of overall activity is amongst a consolidated amount of companies. So a lot of those companies which are no longer participating in the public markets are actually now participating in private markets. The problem is, unlike publicly traded companies, there's less subject to scrutiny and more capable of avoiding our transparency or accountability requests. So one of the large kind of headlines of the book was looking at the worrisome acceleration and shift of private capital away from what's kind of regulatable or regulated, if you will, into this kind of private nether universe. There's other pieces to say there about it being totally disconnected from human rights, environmental impacts, and the pale, male, and stale quality of a lot of private capital and private equity leadership specifically. Next slide, please. So I've said some of this already. I think on the far right, what I want to say is there's opacity around the beneficial owners of private capital, specifically private equity firms, unless you're able to penetrate the limited partnership agreements that general partners have with limited partners. It's very difficult to get information because there's no disclosure requirements on it around who are the actual full set of partners in different private equity investments, whether on equity or debt. It's really difficult to get that information. As a result, for those of us doing campaign, human rights, and environmental justice activities, it's difficult to understand who are the beneficial owners, and therefore really difficult to have ultimate accountability for some of the damage and harms that it causes. Another big piece, which we talk about in the book, is the clear link between the revolving door between state regulation, specifically of the economic sector, specifically the Fed in the US, as well as with general partners of private equity firms. There's a revolving door phenomena that really bleeds state capture in a very obvious way, which is something that also has underwritten a lot of how private equity has been able to develop so quickly over the last 2 decades, and also something that's holding it back from being held more accountable. Next slide, please. So one more slide. Next slide, please. This is my final one. And just a word for those on the line from pension funds and institutional investors. As mentioned, we think that the recommendation that's most wise is to dump private capital slowly and responsibly. Real jobs are on the line if it was dumped too quickly or too with too great of precipitance. But we think that there is overall a need to move away from private capital, back to public markets, back to the public good, back to public control and scrutiny, and that as institutional investors with human rights obligations, requirements, and commitments, I think the best thing that we can do, both from the general partners and limited partner point of view, is think through our own investments, looking at our portfolios and wondering how we can move back into the world of more heavily regulated, more public interest investments, things that really do get away from the netherworld, this kind of opaque place of private equity and private capital. That's it. Thanks so much. Next slide, if you just want to see the web address. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. I think that was a pretty quick overview, but very detailed understanding of the different elements of private market and what has been moving players to private market. And with that, I'd like to move to our next panelist, Michael Kleinman. Michael, I'm not sure whether your camera is on.
It says that I'm unable to start the video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, let's see whether, Saba, are you able to enable his camera? Great. Nice to see you, Michael. Michael, so as the director of Amnesty International Silicon Valley Initiative, Michael was previously the founder and CEO of Orange Door Research, which helped donors, NGOs, and UN agencies gather data in conflict-affected countries. Prior to that, he was a director at Humanity United, and he worked at the intersection of technology and human rights. Michael's also worked on development and human rights and technology. He's also worked in development and humanitarian NGOs in Afghanistan, Iraq, and across East and Central Asia. And your writings on development, human rights, and technology has been published in the Washington Post, Guardian, and other prestigious publications. And with that, I want to sort of hand over to you, and you can talk us through the new or the recent publication by Amnesty International on VCs. With that, thank you, Michael, for joining us today this early in the morning as well. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you so much to everyone who's participating in the webinar. I'm just going to pick up quickly on 2 of the points that Ben raised, looking at how one aspect of private capital, venture capital, is disconnected from human rights, and then the issue around the lack of diversity and what that means when we talk about the impact on human rights. Next slide, please. Very quickly, an introduction to Amnesty. We are an independent Nobel Peace Prize winning global movement of millions of people demanding human rights for all, no matter who you are or where you are. We're the world's largest grassroots human rights organization. And this is important both to frame who Amnesty is, and if I don't say this, then I get in trouble at the start of every presentation. So my contractual obligations to talk about our Nobel Peace Prize have now been met. Next slide. Why did we as Amnesty decide to focus on venture capital firms? VC firms, as you guys well know, shape the future of technology. And what that means is that they shape the future of our economy, our politics, and our society writ large. And if we want to understand, much less influence this future of technology, we need to understand how VC firms decide which startups, which sectors, and which technologies to support. Next slide. As our recent report, Risky Business, shows, venture capitalists today operate with little to no consideration of the broader human rights impact of their investment decisions. And this is a significant problem. Next slide. It's a significant problem for a number of reasons. One of which is that venture capital firms have a responsibility to take into account human rights when making investment decisions. As the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights show and explain, all companies and investors have a responsibility to respect all human rights wherever they operate in the world. What this means, especially when we're talking about investors, including VCs and LPs, is that they must undertake human rights due diligence. This means they must take proactive and ongoing steps to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for the various actual and potential human rights impacts of their investments. Next slide, please. For this report, Risky Business, we surveyed 53 of the world's largest VC firms globally and startup accelerators, supplemented by desk research into these firms' publicly available, where available, due diligence policies and practices. Of the 53 firms and accelerators analyzed, we found that a single firm potentially had adequate human rights due diligence policies in place. So 2% of the firms that we surveyed had what looked to be potentially adequate human rights due diligence processes. Next slide, please. An additional 8 VC firms and accelerators, so 15%, stated that they conduct some level of human rights due diligence, though it wasn't to the level required by the guiding principles. And then overall, for 44 of the 53 VC firms and accelerators we surveyed, that's 83%, we were not able to find evidence that they conduct any human rights due diligence whatsoever. And again, our sample here was the largest VC firms in the world, as set out in the Venture Capital Journal's VCJ 50 list. So we're talking tens of billions of dollars being deployed every year in sectors ranging from GovTech, FinTech, Health Tech, EdTech, without any human rights due diligence whatsoever to try and understand the broader implications of those investments. Next slide, please. This failure to carry out adequate due diligence is, and let me be perfectly clear, a failure of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Next slide, please. There are 3 significant consequences of this VC failure to respect human rights. And all of these slides, I talk about VCs, but the responsibility also applies to LPs who invest in these venture capital firms as well. First, as Anita mentioned at the very beginning, we have found, and others, journalists and other NGOs have found, VC firms invest in companies whose products and services have been directly implicated in ongoing human rights abuses. For instance, the investments that leading US VC firms have made in Chinese facial recognition and surveillance companies, which are implicated in the ongoing repression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. Second, VC firms continue to invest in companies whose business models have a significant negative impact on human rights. 2 examples here. So surveillance capitalism, the idea that social media companies provide their services putatively for free, but what they're doing is gathering more and more and more data on their users in which to sell to advertisers, has a significant and negative impact on our privacy, as we have no control over what information is used, how that information is analyzed, and with whom that information is shared. And then, second example, investments in gig economy companies and the massive impact that that has on labor rights worldwide. Next slide, please. The third consequence of this VC failure to respect human rights is that a lack of due diligence increases the risk that VCs support new technologies and new applications of technology that have a significant negative impact on human rights. And our main concern here is the increasing application of increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence and machine learning tools across a wide range of sectors. And the fact that without adequate human rights due diligence, these tools have the potential, and we've seen in different instances, have actually amplified existing racial and gender biases and discrimination. So for instance, facial recognition tools that are used by police that are far more likely to misidentify Black and brown individuals, or automated HR tools that are far more likely to give lower grades to those from marginalized communities. And without human rights due diligence, without any attempt to understand the impact that these tools have, we are concerned that these kinds of negative consequences will only grow. Next slide, please. Now, this is made worse, this lack of human rights due diligence, by the stunning lack of diversity within the VC sector itself. If you only have a certain kind of voice in the room, then you are much less likely to identify, much less understand the impact that that business model or technology will have on others. And so very quickly, a few statistics. Women comprise only 23% of VC investment staff and 16% of VC investment partners. 4% of VC investment staff are Black, not only 3% of investment partners, and only 4% of VC investment staff are Latinx, and only 4% of investment partners. And if you look at this from an intersectional perspective, looking at the representation of Black or Latinx women, the numbers are even worse. Next slide, please. What this means also, beyond a blinkered view of the implications and consequences of these investments, is that VC firms overwhelmingly give funding to founders who look like them. So all female founding teams received just 2.2% of all US-based VC funding. Founding teams with both a male and female founder received only 15%. And Black and Latinx founders received less than 2.3% of all US-based VC funding in 2019. And as LPs, if you are not asking your VC GPs in whom you invest, whether they do any human rights due diligence, whether and what they are doing about the diversity of their staff and the diversity of the founders whom they fund, then that's, I think, to say the least, problematic. That's all for me. Really can't wait to hear what the next two panelists say, and thank you all again for your time.
Thanks so much, Michael. And, thanks to Amnesty for publishing this report and for taking us through as well some of the, interesting data relating to the lack of diversity within the sector as well, as you ended with that. With that, I'm going to introduce you to Sharmeen Contractor, who is the Senior Advisor with the Marketing Systems and Investor Initiative, or at Oxfam. And she currently provides research on investments and engaging on advocacy with investors on social and environmental impacts and risks of their of their investments, especially for vulnerable communities globally. Prior to Oxfam, Charmaine worked with SOC Investment Group, formerly the CTW Investment Group, as an ESG research analyst, where she was also providing research and engaging on advocacy on issues of human capital management. With that, we have Charmaine today to speak to us on private equity investments in land and the impact on communities in the food and beverage industry. Oxfam recently published a briefing, Food for Thought, Investing in a Sustainable Food System. And I will hand it to Charmaine to tell us more about this. Thank you, Charmaine, for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anita, and thank you, ICCR, for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And thanks to all the participants for making the time. I will be speaking about why it is important for investors to understand the impacts on the ground that affect the ability of ensuring a stable and resilient food system. Next slide, please. In September, Oxfam released its report highlighting for investors the human rights risks in food supply chain. This report documented evidence by Oxfam and its partners about human rights violations in food supply chains. This is despite the fact that many of the companies downstream have committed to human rights policies and practices. Some of the violations we documented include poor working conditions in India in the sugar supply chain, low wages earned by seafood workers in Thailand, forced labor in Brazil in the coffee sector, child labor in Ghana, gender inequality across many sectors from seafood, coffee, and wine in South Africa, poor safety standards for migrant workers in Southeast Asia, supplying food to supermarkets in Europe and US, and violation of community rights across the globe. Next slide, please. Taking a closer look at the impacts during COVID, we evidenced, and this isn't, again, a major revelation to many of you, that women bore the brunt of the crisis. This experience wasn't only unique to women working in the food sector in the US, but across the supply chain globally. And in general, we concluded that, as you know, women faced increased childcare demands as children stayed home because of school closures and limited caregiving options. They were more likely to be exposed to unsafe working conditions in comparison to men because more of them are informal workers, and more women in the food sector lost their jobs than men because of the low level of formal working agreements for women. So what all this leads us to conclude is that steps companies are taking to address human rights challenges aren't nearly enough. There is a significant mismatch between policies of some players at the top of the food chain or in headquarters of multinational companies versus activities on the ground. Next slide, please. So you might ask, what role does private investment play in associated human rights risk if I'm talking about public companies? Well, while the report does not exclusively address private investment, we cannot ignore that these actors play a big role in exacerbating these conditions. Private investment is at the heart of it all. Private equity has a strong footprint in companies in these upstream supply chains. So let's take a closer look at the palm oil sector in the Amazon in Peru. The sector is still small, but is rapidly growing. In 2004, Peru had sown over 20,000 hectares, which grew to 50,000 in 2012. And last year, the country almost doubled the plantations. Growth has happened without regard for environmental or community rights. In general, communities in the sector have not gone through the normal consultation and acquisition process. They have obtained land without conducting environmental impact studies. They have obtained land without which is not demarcated for agriculture. So in essence, in protected forest areas, and they've obtained land without community consent and have gained environmental certifications illegally. Oxfam's research a few years ago showed that the new medium and large scale plantations cover over 200,000 acres across 3 provinces in Peru. Many of these plantations overlap with indigenous community land claims. Across the globe, some of the biggest investors in these companies are those in the US and many through private equity firms, such as those Ben mentioned, such as KKR and Blackstone. Those also focused on land acquisitions include Altima, Amera, Brookfield, and Proterra. Amera is one of the largest private equity investors in palm oil in Peru. Next slide, please. So private equity is one of the biggest drivers of land inequality. Thanks to large-scale land acquisitions perpetuated by these players, land inequality is pervasive and growing, and it directly threatens the livelihoods of billions in local communities. As corporate and financial investments in land have grown, ownership of and control of land have become more concentrated and more opaque. The growing role of financial markets and actors treats land as an asset class and can significantly change the way it is controlled and used. This economic model, which assumes big is efficient, comes with big externalities. Big pushes people off land. Big is also environmentally destructive and results in greater carbon emissions and deforestation. In the case of the Peruvian Amazon, it is estimated that around 30,000 hectares of forest have already been lost due to oil palm plantations. Big has also resulted in increasing conflicts over land, which in many cases have led to violent and deadly attacks against communities seeking to protect their territories. In fact, land inequality has been increasing over the past 40 years, and the largest 1% of farms already operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. Yet recent research shows these figures significantly underestimate inequality levels. Next slide, please. Failing to address land inequality is also a missed opportunity. Data shows that Indigenous people and traditional communities are efficient. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change acknowledges that Indigenous groups and communities are critical for fighting climate change. Land held by these communities is an important carbon sink. They hold at least 22% of the carbon stored in tropical and subtropical forests. In Bolivia, Brazil, and Colombia, according to the World Resource Institute, deforestation rates on tenure secure indigenous lands are significantly lower than on similar surrounding areas. In Peru, it is estimated that more than 2.8 million metric tons of carbon have been released into the atmosphere due to deforestation caused by oil palm crops in the Amazon during the last 20 years. There is considerable potential for more carbon to be stored on degraded indigenous and community lands if they were secured, better protected, and restored. Land is they are also responsible for better forest management. So at least 36% of the world's intact forest, which is defined as large unbroken swaths of natural forest, are within indigenous lands, and they are better maintained than in non-indigenous ones. These forests play a crucial role in sequestering carbon, protecting biodiversity, regulating water supply, and providing a range of ecosystem services central to the well-being of society. They are more cost-effective. Sequestering carbon by securing indigenous land is a cost-effective approach to climate mitigation, especially when compared to other methods. For example, the cost of carbon capture and storage for coal-fired power plants is 5 to 25 times more expensive than securing indigenous lands. In August this year, Oxfam released another report, Tightening the Net, which looks at implications of net zero climate commitments on land and food securities, and relays the importance of consulting with and listening to local communities if we are to combat climate change. What we don't realize is that land is the basis of everything. You can't do anything without land, and yet the preservation of land doesn't appear to be a top priority. Solutions proposed to combat climate change are centered on the use of land. And two big considerations over here that we need to take note of. One is that land is a finite resource. And because it is finite, demand for land for nature-based solutions to combat climate change will compete with demand for land for food security. And that could impact hundreds of millions across the globe. We at Oxfam aren't advocating that the private sector not use nature-based solutions, but that they should limit their use in the achievement of net zero targets. Increased competition for land could lead to higher food prices and a larger population at risk of hunger. This is especially concerning since there is enough evidence to show that local and indigenous communities can be critical actors in the fight against climate change. So securing community rights to land should be a top priority. Next slide, please. So what can you do? What can you as investors do? As investors, you can play an important role in creating a resilient and stable food system by initiating change from within your portfolios, the way you invest and among the companies in your portfolios. You can do so by aligning investment policies and practices with international human rights standards. This should include adopting due diligence processes. Elevating human rights is an important performance standard for companies and within your portfolios, and ensuring investment managers embed human rights in investment decision-making and basing performance of senior executives on human rights performance. You can do so by ensuring that human rights is a priority and hence cross-cutting issue across your investment portfolios. You can also do so by restructuring the way human rights is assessed by encouraging companies to focus on the long-term value creation, contributing to shaping a regulatory agenda centered on human rights and working with stakeholders to design a human rights framework. Without comprehensive and bold action by you, commitments by companies to monitor their investments and those down the supply chain will remain elusive. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I mean, really putting it to investors, we have that responsibility to respect human rights. We have that responsibility to undertake human rights due diligence and to get our portfolio companies to as well embrace and undertake that same human rights and risk management model in terms of addressing any of their business activities and relationships. So thanks so much for that. And we're really fortunate to have now an investment professional that can give us that perspective. We're very lucky to have Hannah Leach with us today. She is a partner at Houghton Street Ventures, a new venture firm backing companies founded by students and alumni of the London School of Economics. So we're really, going with starting at this with students and the new generation, which is what we're looking at. And Hannah is also the co-founder of a global industry-wide initiatives, Venture Esgs, whose aim is to help the VC sector recognize the importance of ESG and to provide resources and guidance to make ESG a standard part of due diligence, portfolio management, and fund management. So with that, let me hand off to Hannah to tell us more about how we can really look at responsible, investing in the VC space. Hannah.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you to you and Rebecca for having me. I hope that I can kind of end this on a somewhat hopeful note, but let's see. Isaba, next slide would be great, thank you. So I feel like this is very obvious after, all the other people having spoken, but, particularly Michael, that VC is very late to ESG. And even when we started thinking about this 18 months ago, we came to the conclusion that no one in venture was really taking ESG seriously or going beyond kind of simple exclusions list. There were a few exceptions to the rule. I think Atomico, Michael mentioned those in his presentation. They have their conscious scaling framework, and then the Omidyar network had done some work on ethical iOS, but generally venture hasn't considered how this applies. As Ben said, VC is somewhat a small industry in comparison to other areas of private capital, so it has perhaps been a bit neglected. There's also just a lack of standards and VC specific guidelines actually driving that and kind of supporting in GPs and LPs and thinking through how this should be done at the venture stage. There's been no pressure to date, and there's also no data when it comes to early stage companies and venture in terms of identifying what we're measuring when it comes to ESG and whether that you can draw a line between that and growth of companies. So even now thinking what we're trying to think through what that is. But I think if you look at how things have changed, particularly over the last 18 months, venture funds are now starting to think more clearly about what ESG means and how they can introduce it and integrate it into their end-to-end investment activity. And there are a few reasons for this, transfer of wealth to younger generations who really do kind of care and are more mindful about where they invest their money, and also which companies they work for. There is new and increasing regulation, so SFDR and the European taxonomy in Europe, and then the SEC looking to introduce stuff. Greater pressure from LPs. I think LPs have on the back of Me Too and Black Lives Matter paying greater attention to these issues, maybe still not to the extent that they should, but definitely kind of more aware. There have been a lot of fallouts in big tech. I don't think we need to tell anyone that, across a number of different issue areas, but it's really highlighted that we should be thinking about things in a different way. Employees have greater agency and voice. So I think tools like Omidyar's ethical iOS is really equipping employees with being able to ask their employers the right questions and hold them to account. There's greater interest in scrutiny from customers. A flippant example, but Waitrose in the UK has introduced a B Corp aisle. Like, customers do care about this now. And I think increasingly as we see that founders are looking for investors who are value aligned and actually can support them in introducing some of these measures internally. Next slide. So who is Venture ESG? We are, as Nita said, a new global industry initiative trying to support the VCs with implementing more robust ESG practices. We started out as a group of about 20 funds in December, and we've now grown to about 180 venture funds across the US, Canada, Latin America, UK, Europe, Israel, India, and Japan. And we're really trying to bring people together to support them with access to knowledge, access to specific VC guidance and toolkits, sharing best practice, and access to experts who can support them on a number of these areas. We also have a group of 60 or so LPs, so family offices, state funds, pension funds, endowment funds, funds of funds, and really trying to talk to them and understand how they are approaching venture funds specifically, and how they can, if not already, treat venture differently when it comes to their ESG due diligence, that they should be looking at new measures. From our perspective, actually, if you go to the next slide, Saba. From our perspective, when we started researching into this about 18 months ago, we realized that lots of the existing frameworks and standards were just not relevant for venture in their entirety. They weren't fit for purpose, and they couldn't necessarily be taken and used. So we started off thinking through what is different about venture, and what are the different challenges it presents when you're looking at it from the perspective of ESG. So I think, as Michael mentioned, it's emerging technologies, rapidly evolving business models, teams that are growing at a rate of knots. You need to look at things that you wouldn't have looked at in a traditional public company. So particularly going deep around responsible product design, data privacy and security, some things around team and working environment. So when we started working on this area and working on this framework, we took the best of what was out there from existing standards and frameworks, and then plugged it with things that were relevant to early stage companies and venture. And we've structured it across all of these 8 different issue areas. Obviously, this is very high level, and you will note that we don't have a specific section on human rights. From our perspective, human rights is integrated throughout all of these areas. So if you take the example of team and working environment, you have living wage, you have health and safety, you have forced labor, you have contracts, you have gig economy. If you go into data privacy and security, you have actually just having data privacy policies and processes, transparency with the user about how you're using their data and in what way, and which third parties you're sharing it with. You have team training on security issues. And then you move forward to responsible product design, and you've got adverse impacts, the bias in AI and data, as Michael mentioned, accessibility of a product and inclusivity in the way that it's designed, and then governance structures, which could include which stakeholders you bring into the conversation around the product. So human rights for us is very much integrated through all of these different issue areas. Next slide, please. I think one of the pushbacks we get, perhaps this is less relevant to the GPs themselves and more to the funds, but it's more to the companies. But it's too early for seed stage, Series A stage companies to think about this. And there's no time. They're working on their product, or getting customers on board, or fundraising. And no, for us, that's not the point. We need to talk to companies and make funds aware that this is really, we've got to embed ESG in the processes from the get-go. This shouldn't be an add-on exercise. It shouldn't be a tick box exercise. It should just be integrated into the fabric of how you're running your business. If you're going to be hiring, you should make sure that you're doing it in a diverse and inclusive way. If you're bringing out a product, you need to make sure you've considered the adverse impacts and are building it in a humane, responsible fashion. Once a company starts implementing practices and instills a culture, it can be very hard to change further down the line. Startups are very immune to risk. If there was a startup that had a data privacy, a data breach, it would be very hard to build that trust back with their consumers. And important to note that corporate being a kind of responsible corporate citizen, if you want to call it that, can really drive customer growth, help you bring on board the best talent, ease market entry, and can prove a differentiator. So we're really advocating that ESG is not a tick box exercise. It's not about scorecards. It's actually working with founders to help them understand how they're thinking about these issues, how they're thinking about building their company, what is their intent around this, what are their blind spots, and actually really supporting them on this journey once we've invested. Next slide, please. VCs, we really don't want to do the thing where we're doing, say as I do and not as I do. We want to make sure, do as I say and not as I do, as I say, not as I do. We really want to make sure that we're actually implementing processes internally and making sure that we are ESG aligned in the way that we operate. So looking across all of these areas, building a diverse and inclusive culture, how are we hiring, how are we sourcing companies, do we have internal codes of conduct, do we have anti-discrimination policies, shared parental leave, is there a grievance mechanism, what is our environmental impact, are we managing it, are we aware, are we reporting and tracking? And do we have good governance structures in place? I think it's key that in order for us to support our companies, we need to take care of our own house. Next slide, please. Anita, I'm almost done. And it needs to be an integrated approach. So it can't just come in one area. We need to integrate it from screening, due diligence, investment, portfolio management, and ongoing reporting. I'm sorry, I don't have more time to talk about this, but it's fully integrated. Next slide, please. And where are we going with this now? So we want to really get to a point where we build consensus with funds around what issues are important, regardless of the stage, the size, the sector you're operating in. We're working with LPs to create VC-specific ESG guidelines, and it's really about building internal capacity within funds. So how are we training investment teams on ESG? What are the guidelines they're using? And can we continue to build out the stakeholder community across funds, across subject matter experts, across governance, across industry organizations to really build commitment to this and introduce a level of accountability? Thank you very much. I'm done.
No, thanks for running through that so quickly, Hannah. We seem to run out of time quite quickly. We've had such great input from you as well, and really great to see the initiative that you're working on. I think we've talked about this as well, sort of offline, Hannah. Really looking to speak to you more about the criteria and the toolkits you're creating, and the need, I guess, for human rights to be called out specifically, but that's, ongoing conversations as we all go through process and evolution, as we look at investors' responsibility to respect human rights. I was just going to get Michael also on the screen, and wanted to thank everybody for attending this session. We only have 2 minutes left, and so we don't really have time for questions and answers. But what I wanted to do is, just give it to the panelists, just to really give some quick observations, maybe 30 seconds each, relating to, I guess, the role that they see government play in terms of regulating and holding private equity to account. I think we've talked about investor responsibility, but really just wanted to get all of you as closing remarks, anything else you have to add on this statement. With that, I'm going to hand to Ben to kick it off, and then just everyone else too. Thanks.
Anita, thanks to you and Rebecca and the Alliance for this opportunity. I'm glad we had a chance to do this. It's unfortunate time ran out, but it's because of the great presentation, so it's okay. Understood. What I would say is that in the chat, I answered a bunch of questions. I wasn't able to answer all of them, but essentially there are a couple big inputs into the private capital universe. Really out of control leverage, 8 to 40x leverage over an original fund's equity investment, which is worrisome. B, the amount of limited partner investment that seems locked up once limited partner agreements are signed, which the LPAs essentially prevent limited partners from adding additional scrutiny or due diligence and accountability measures into during the lifetime, often 10-year span of those limited partner agreements. In addition to that, the simple flow of money from public into private markets, as mentioned, because the tax level is less and the amount of interest is so cheap that people are essentially able to leverage on their investments and create money in those private spaces. These three reasons are essentially the largest drivers at the economic level behind the private capital markets. And collectively, if we want better ESG practices we want to engage versus divest from private capital markets, which I'm not convinced about. But if that's the way to go, then we really should redirect some of our fire at the SEC, at the Fed, at least in the United States, to do more about these out of control, low interest rates, to do a lot more about the leverage requirements, right? Which basically seem unlimited for a lot of these investments, and do a lot more to try to open up legally LPAs once they're signed, to give limited partners like pension funds and asset managers the ability to assist on greater scrutiny and due diligence mechanisms. These three kind of steps, if you will, would go a long ways towards kind of raising the tide or raising the level of accountability for private capital.
Great, thank you. Michael, Sharmeen, what is your views on, the need for regulation to as well talk to Ben's point about raising the accountability and the transparency? Maybe Michael, we can go with you first. Oh, you're on mute, Michael.
I'll cede my time to Sharmeen.
Oh, okay, Sharmeen, cool.
I'll be really, really quick. I think I spoke about this in my recommendations. I think, as Ben mentioned, just really contribute to shaping a regulatory agenda centered on human rights and encouraging, especially now that we have an SEC commissioner that is focused on ESG, really encouraging not only regulators, but also legislators to focus on the adoption of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. Thanks.
No, great. And we have that as well going on in Europe. Hannah, any last words before?
I was just going to say SFDR is there, and it's, I would just say it needs to consider how it can be made venture specific, because currently it is not really easily adoptable by venture. And I think if by funds, and I think you need to make the balance between like depth, but also like practicality. And for venture funds, it's just not, it hasn't been designed with them in mind.
No, great point, Hannah. And with that, really thank you to everyone for joining the conversation today. We will share all the slides, the recordings, post this call. Really have a look at the Investor Toolkit for Human Rights that really tries to address some of these issues, provide some practical ways in which investors can start to take steps today to address the issues, not just in the private equity market, but as well in the public equity market, as human rights, applies across the board in all our investment activities. Thanks to everyone today. Thanks to our wonderful panelists, and to Asaba and Rebecca for helping to pull this together. Thanks to all the participants, and good night, good evening, good afternoon, and thanks to all. Bye-bye.